in the shadowy depths of history's darkest archives.
In 1991, as America swayed to the upbeat rhythms of pop rock, flocked to vibrant blockbuster films, and embraced the hopeful promise of a new era of connection, a silent darkness was slowly consuming lost souls in the quiet city of Milwaukee. Do you remember the feeling of safety? Of open doors and trusting neighbors? Imagine, for a moment, that tonight you simply walk past the threshold of an ordinary-looking apartment, lured inside by a simple offer, a conversation, a beer, a helping hand. You would never suspect that those few steps marked the border between the life you knew and a hell on earth no one could possibly fathom. A place where hopes evaporated into thin air, where bodies became objects, and where the soul was suffocated by an unspeakable horror. This isn't just a story about a serial killer. This is a journey through the ordinary facade of suburban life, exploring how a deranged mind turned basic human connection into a vortex of violence and ultimate isolation. We will delve into the cracks in our social systems, the cries for help that went ignored, and the chilling question: how did a monster hide in plain sight for so long, right under all of our noses? On the humid night of the 22nd of July, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, settled into the familiar, sticky warmth of a Midwest summer. In the city's west side, the neon lights of bars and storefronts cast long, distorted shadows onto streets that had grown accustomed to the laughter of people getting off work or the quiet desperation of those looking for a place to belong. Officer Eddie, who was used to Mondays being more subdued than the noisy weekends, drove slowly down North 25th Street, his windows down just enough to let in the thick, muggy air. The radio hummed a familiar tune, a faded pop hit from the 82nd, a reminder of a time that seemed less complicated. Eddie's eyes scanned the dense trees and brick houses, preparing for a night that would likely be as uneventful as any other. Suddenly, a stark break in the monotony. A young man, who looked to be in his early 20s, was sprinting down North 25th Street. He wasn't just running, he was bolting, his breath coming in frantic gasps. A pair of metal handcuffs dangling from one wrist. The streetlights flashed across his face, and Eddie saw a look of pure, unadulterated terror etched into his features. This wasn't a drunken brawl or a common thief on the run. This was something more primal, more urgent. He was shirtless, wearing only a pair of jeans, and his other hand was yanking at the restraint, as if trying to tear himself free from an invisible chain. "Hey, what's going on?" Eddie yelled from his squad car, hitting the brakes. The young man was Tracy Edwards. His fear had taken hold of him so completely that he could barely speak. He collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. Eddie and his partner, Officer Robert Routh, quickly approached. As they got closer, Tracy scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide as he pointed back toward his own apartment. Number 213. In a tired-looking cream-colored building, Eddie followed Tracy's gaze. And there, behind Tracy, another man emerged from the shadows. He was tall, with light hair, and a seemingly friendly face. But his eyes, Eddie couldn't place it. But there was something cold and empty in the man's stare. That man was Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, dressed in jeans and a dark shirt, walked with an eerie calmness. He tried to explain the situation away, his voice even, as a simple lover's quarrel. Just a little domestic squabble between lovers, he said, trying to smooth over Tracy's frantic panic. He even tried to pull Tracy back with him, as if this were just a small misunderstanding to be handled in private. But Tracy wasn't having it. He pointed at Dahmer and screamed, his voice trembling with a terror that gave every word a terrible weight. "He wants to kill me. He wants to eat my heart." Eddie and Routh exchanged glances. The accusation was too monstrous to ignore, but too fantastical to believe outright. However, the handcuffs on Tracy's wrist were real, and his fear was undeniable. They decided to separate the two for questioning. While Routh talked to Tracy, Eddie confronted Dahmer. Eddie could feel something was off about this man. Dahmer stood there, unsettlingly calm, showing no signs of panic or distress. He simply admitted that Tracy had gotten free from the handcuffs and fled his apartment. "Handcuffs?" Eddie frowned. "Why do you have handcuffs?" Dahmer answered without a pause, his voice as if he were just stating a matter of fact. "We had a drink, and he wanted me to cuff him for a photo shoot." The explanation sounded ridiculous, but in the oppressive heat of the summer night, surrounded by the usual domestic disputes of the neighborhood, Eddie and Routh still hadn't seen a clear sign of a monstrous crime. Nevertheless, they decided they had to check Dahmer's apartment, as that was where Tracy had fled from. As they walked toward the building, neither of them could have known that behind the door of apartment 213, a world of unimaginable horror awaited. That door didn't just lead into an apartment. It was the gateway to the hell that Jeffrey Dahmer had built. Step by step, in the shadows of a city that was sound asleep, the rain began to fall. A steady, relentless drumming against the car's windshield as Eddie and Routh drove toward a truth they weren't prepared for. But for now, they were simply two officers on a mundane call, about to check a man's apartment for a pair of handcuffs. As they approached the building, a different kind of rain began to fall. The rain of memory, of cold facts and forgotten details that shaped the man they were about to confront. Jeffrey Dahmer's story didn't begin with a blood-stained apartment door in Milwaukee. It began much earlier, in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, where he was born into a seemingly normal family. But from a young age, something was off. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, later described a happy, energetic toddler who, after a double hernia surgery around age 4, became withdrawn and listless. It was a subtle shift, a change that could have been attributed to the simple trauma of a hospital stay. But what if it was something more? What if it was the first sign of a mind folding inward, separating from the world around it? In the quiet of his suburban neighborhood, little Jeff found solace in the morbid. While other boys played with Joes, he was drawn to dead animals. He collected roadkill, meticulously dissecting them in the woods behind his house. He would skin them, to dissolve their flesh in jars of chemicals, and save the bones. It was a macabre hobby, dismissed by his father as a strange fascination with science. But Lionel Dahmer, a chemist, saw something else. A disturbing mirror of his own laboratory work. A meticulous, almost sterile curiosity. He couldn't have known that this fascination with the internal structures of animals would one day translate to humans. He simply saw a boy who needed a project, a connection to his father. As he moved through his teenage years, Dahmer became a ghost in his own life. He was a competitive tennis player, and briefly in the school band, but he was an outcast, known for his awkwardness and his constant drunkenness. He began drinking heavily in high school, a habit that served as a shield against the world he felt disconnected from. He was a master of evasion, a chameleon blending in by becoming a caricature of a normal, if socially awkward, teenager. His peers might have found him strange, but no one saw the darkness brewing beneath the surface. No one saw the fantasies that were beginning to consume him. Fantasies of domination and control, of a complete and total submission from another human being. These thoughts, born out of a desperate loneliness and an inability to connect, were the building blocks of the monster he would become. As Eddie and Routh walked up the cracked steps to the building, they were blissfully unaware of this history. They were just two cops, doing their job. They saw a quiet, unassuming man, not the product of a childhood that had, in its own way, become a breeding ground for something evil. They couldn't hear the echoes of a young boy's past in the oppressive silence of the hallway. They couldn't smell the ghosts of the dead animals he once collected, or feel the cold, detached curiosity that had driven him for so long. They simply saw an apartment door, number 213, waiting to be opened. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. A few moments later, the door creaked open just a crack. Eddie saw a flicker of movement inside. The story was just beginning, and the true horror lay just beyond the threshold. This video provides an overview of the Conversations with a Killer, the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes docuseries on Netflix. The air in the hallway of the Oxford apartments, on the night of the 22nd of July, was thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant, old cigarette smoke, and something else, a faint, sour odor that seemed to seep from the walls. Officers Eddie and Routh didn't consciously register it, but it was there, an invisible stain on the otherwise normal surroundings. Jeffrey Dahmer opened the door to apartment 213, just wide enough for the officers to see a slice of a dim, messy living room. He remained calm, almost too calm, as he stepped aside to let them in. The first thing the officers noticed was the pervasive darkness. All the windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking out any light from the street below. The air was still and warm, with no breeze. A large fish tank bubbled softly in the corner, and the room was a jumble of clothes, food containers, and household items. It looked like the apartment of a single man who didn't spend much time cleaning. But it was that smell that was beginning to assert itself, a cloying, metallic stench that was somehow both sickly sweet and deeply putrid. "The handcuffs are in the bedroom," Dahmer said, his voice as flat as a tabletop. "I'll go get them for you." As he moved away, Eddie's eyes scanned the room, his police instincts on high alert. Something was just wrong. He saw an open bottle of wine on a table, next to a large knife. He also noticed a peculiar sketch on the wall, a drawing of a man with a blank expression. And in the corner, a large drum. The details were just odd enough to linger in the back of his mind. He followed Dahmer into the bedroom, a cramped space dominated by a king-sized bed. Dahmer reached under the bed and pulled out a keyring. He held it up, a single pair of handcuffs dangling from it. "Here they are," he said. Eddie's attention was drawn to a bedside cabinet. It was a simple piece of furniture, but something about it seemed off. He was just about to ask a question when his eyes settled on a nightstand drawer. It was slightly ajar. Without thinking, Eddie reached out and opened it further. Inside, a flash of something Polaroid caught his eye. He pulled it out. The image was of a dismembered body. It wasn't a photograph of an accident or a crime scene. It was a macabre portrait. The body was lying on a bed, and the face had a peaceful, serene look, as if the person were asleep. But the limbs had been severed and arranged in a chillingly composed manner. The image was sickeningly, disturbingly intimate. Eddie froze. The photo held between his thumb and forefinger. He stared at it, then at Dahmer, whose expression had not changed. He looked back at the photo, and then at the face on the photo, then at Dahmer's face again. In that moment, the seemingly quiet, unassuming man in front of him transformed. The calm facade shattered, revealing the chilling truth beneath. This was not a domestic dispute. This was something else entirely. What in the hell is this? Eddie's voice was low and dangerous. Dahmer sighed, a sound of resignation rather than fear. The game was up. He began to slowly step toward Eddie. In a flash of pure instinct, Eddie drew his firearm, his voice firm and commanding. "Don't move. Get on the floor. Now." The sudden tension broke the spell. Routh, hearing the commotion, rushed into the bedroom. He saw the photo in Eddie's hand, his eyes widening in a mixture of horror and disbelief. But what he saw next, as Eddie pulled Dahmer to the ground, would haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked toward the bedroom closet and saw a human skull sitting on the top shelf. Looking down at them, this was no longer just an apartment. It was a tomb, a private museum of horrors that Dahmer had created, piece by sickening piece. Hidden behind the facade of a normal life, the handcuffs clattered to the floor, a mundane sound that was swallowed by the sudden, deafening silence. The smell, so subtle moments before, now screamed at the two officers. It was a chemical, acrid odor, mixed with the unmistakable, metallic scent of rot. It clung to everything: the furniture, the curtains, the very air itself. This wasn't the smell of trash. It was the smell of death, meticulously hidden and poorly contained. It was a smell the neighbors on the second floor of the Oxford apartments had come to know all too well. For months, Glenda Cleveland had been a one-woman neighborhood watch, a formidable, no-nonsense woman with a keen eye and a sharper tongue. She lived in the building next door, close enough to be unnerved by the constant, low-grade strangeness coming from apartment 213. She had called the police multiple times. The first time was about the smell, a sickening odor she described as a mixture of something burning and something spoiling. Like rotten meat, the police had come, and Dahmer, ever calm and collected, had simply told them his freezer was broken and he was trying to clean up spoiled meat. The officers, finding no other cause for suspicion, had left. Glenda had seen other things. Two strange young men, mostly black and brown, walking into the building with Dahmer and never being seen again. She'd heard power drills and the unsettling whir of a saw late at night. She had even seen Dahmer walking with a large, heavy garbage bag that seemed to be leaking a dark liquid. It was a series of unsettling moments, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle she was trying to assemble. But the police kept telling her the pieces didn't fit. The most chilling incident, however, had happened just a few months prior. Glenda and her daughter, Sandra, had witnessed a young, half-naked boy named Konarak Synthesamphone stumbling out of Dahmer's apartment. He was bleeding, confused, and terrified. When they called the police, Dahmer had again appeared, calm and persuasive, telling the officers that the boy was his 4-year-old lover and they had just been having a domestic dispute. The officers, accepting Dahmer's word and a forged ID, had escorted the boy back inside the apartment. Glenda had protested, pleaded with them to check his ID more carefully. She had watched with rising horror as the patrol car drove away, leaving the young boy to his fate. She didn't know it then, but Konarak would become Dahmer's 11th victim. Now, as Officer Eddie stood in the living room of 213, a Polaroid of a dismembered body in his hand, a chilling realization washed over him. He had dismissed the smell. He had ignored the fleeting oddities. He had, in his own way, been a part of the system that had failed so many. The voices of the neighbors, the whispers of fear and suspicion, had been there all along, but they had been drowned out by the noise of everyday life, by the polite assurances of a man who looked so normal, who acted so calm. The horror was not just what was in the apartment, but the fact that it had been hiding in plain sight for so long. The terrifying scent in the air was the truth that no one wanted to believe, and now it was a stench they would never forget. The bedroom of apartment 213 was a suffocating tomb of secrets. As Eddie and Routh moved cautiously through the apartment, their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene of calculated chaos. The air was thick, with the scent of death, and now that they knew what they were looking for, they found it everywhere. A quick search of the kitchen revealed a pot on the stove filled with a milky white substance, a human hand floating within it. In the refrigerator, a severed head, carefully stored and wrapped in plastic. A human heart, preserved as if it were a scientific specimen. The horrors were not random. They were arranged with a chilling, surgical precision. But the most haunting discovery was the photos, stacked neatly in a bedside drawer. They were not just evidence, they were a gallery of horrors. Close-up shots of dismembered bodies, smiling faces in lifeless repose, and posed scenes of depravity that chronicled a macabre evolution of obsession. They were a timeline, a visual ledger of a monster's work in the cold, unflinching glare of the flashlight. Eddie could see the faces of the victims, faces that were now familiar from the missing person posters that littered the city. The faces of Konarak Synthesamphone, of Anthony Sears, of Errol Lindsay. He saw the faces of the young men Glenda Cleveland had tried to warn them about. Adib. Visceral wave of guilt washed over Eddie. He and his fellow officers had been called to the Oxford apartments multiple times. They had spoken to the victims and to the neighbors who saw something was wrong, but they had always accepted Dahmer's quiet, reasonable explanations. The system had failed. The police, the very people sworn to protect the public, had returned a terrified, underage boy to the man who would kill him. They had dismissed the pleas of a concerned citizen. They had prioritized convenience and a quick resolution over a thorough investigation. The full weight of this failure settled on Eddie's shoulders. He looked at the skull in the closet, the bones in the barrel, and the photos in his hand, and he understood the full scope of their negligence. These weren't just victims of a lone killer. They were also victims of a broken system, The police had given Dahmer the space he needed to kill. A silent, unspoken permission to continue his reign of terror. The cries for help, the desperate pleas, and the nagging suspicions had been a symphony playing in the background, but no one had truly listened. And because of that, a dozen more men had paid the ultimate price, all while their killer lived a quiet, unassuming life, secure in the knowledge that he was above suspicion. The silence in the room was now deafening. It was the silence of a truth revealed, of a horrific reality no one wanted to believe, but could no longer ignore. The nightmare of Jeffrey Dahmer was over. But for the victims' families, for the city of Milwaukee, and for the officers who stood in that apartment, the reckoning had just begun. The full scope of the horrors in apartment 213 was now laid bare. Jeffrey Dahmer was in custody, his calm demeanor finally cracking as he was led from the building. The city of Milwaukee was in shock. The world was watching, and the investigation had just begun. But to understand the full terror of what had just been uncovered, one had to go back to the beginning of the end. After his discharge from the Army for alcoholism in 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer came home, a ghost returning to a house that was no longer a home. His parents were divorced. His father, Lionel, had remarried and moved, leaving Jeff to live alone in the family home in Ohio. This was when his true descent began. He had tasted blood for the first time years ago. In 1978, with the murder of Stephen Hicks. But now, with no one to hold him accountable, and no one to care about his whereabouts, his fantasies took on a terrifying new life. His loneliness was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket. He craved control, but more than that, he craved companionship, not as a peer, but as a possession. He wanted to own someone, to have them entirely, forever. He spent his days in a fog of alcohol, an addiction that fueled his worst impulses while also dulling the emotional pain of his isolation. His life became a chilling cycle. Find a victim, bring them to his home, incapacitate them with drugs or alcohol, and then kill them. But the killing was never the end. The real goal was preservation. He would dissect his victims, attempting to create a permanent bond, a twisted form of affection. He boiled skulls, stripped bones, and experimented with acid, trying to create the ultimate trophies. He kept a human heart in his refrigerator and a collection of bones in a filing cabinet. To a sane person, these were the acts of a depraved psychopath. But to Dahmer, he was curating a macabre collection of his closest, most intimate friends. In 1987, his father, concerned by his son's destructive lifestyle, moved him to Milwaukee. Lionel believed that by giving his son a new start, he might find some normalcy. He couldn't have been more wrong. The city, with its busy streets and transient population, became his hunting ground. He found victims in gay bars and on street corners. Men who were often alone and vulnerable. Just like him, he would bring them back to his new apartment, a place where he could be his true, terrifying self. Hidden behind a locked door, he became a master of deception, charming and polite, a quiet man who kept to himself. No one saw the predator beneath the surface. He was a creature of habit, and his habitat was his home, a place he meticulously transformed into a tomb, where the living became his dead. The interrogation room was a sterile, unforgiving space. A cold table, 2 chairs, and the hum of a single fluorescent light, Jeffrey Dahmer sat opposite a Detective Kennedy. His posture relaxed, his expression blank. He had waived his right to an attorney, telling the detective in a flat, monotone voice, "I did it." He was ready to talk. The detectives had been briefed on the horrors of apartment 213. They had seen the photos and the human remains, but what they heard from Dahmer's own mouth was far more chilling. He began to narrate his story, a chillingly detailed account of his crimes, delivered with the emotional detachment of someone reading a grocery list. He spoke of the 13 victims he had brought to that apartment, the methodical process of killing them, and his macabre attempts to preserve them. The narrative began with an invitation, a casual offer of a drink. He would use sedatives, drugs that would render his victims unconscious. The murders were cold, calculated acts of control. But what came after was even more grotesque. He spoke of dismemberment, of acid baths, of keeping skulls as trophies. He described his hunger for power and possession, and his compulsion to keep his victims with him forever. It was a compulsion born of a deep, abiding loneliness, a twisted desire to never be abandoned again. But the most haunting part of his confession was not the details of the murders, but the absence of emotion. There was no remorse, no guilt, no sense of sin. When asked about his motive, he simply said, "I wanted to control them, to have them with me. I didn't want them to leave." To Dahmer, his victims were not people. They were objects, possessions to be used and discarded. The confession continued for hours, each word a new punch to the gut for the detectives. They asked about the missing men, the cold cases that had gone unsolved for years, and Dahmer provided the answers with a shocking, matter-of-fact clarity. He filled in the blanks of a dozen disappearances. A quiet, polite man who spoke of cannibalism and necrophilia as if they were everyday hobbies. He described his attempts to create zombies, to control his victims, even after death. He was a monster, but a monster who understood the power of an open and honest confession. When he was done talking, the detectives were exhausted, their minds reeling. They had a full confession, a definitive timeline, and a chilling window into the mind of a killer. But they also had a sense of profound unease. They had spent hours with a man who had committed unspeakable acts, but who showed no sign of humanity, no glimmer of a soul. They had faced the face of pure evil, and it was a quiet, unassuming man who simply said, "I did it." The truth was revealed, but the questions remained. How could a human being do this? And how did they hide for so long? Right under everyone's noses? The silence in the interrogation room was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the air conditioner and the scratch of a pen on paper. Jeffrey Dahmer, now a confessed killer, sat calmly, his eyes vacant. He had given them the roadmap to his horrors, and now it was up to the detectives to follow the trail. They called for a full search of apartment 213, a search that would reveal the true, gruesome extent of Dahmer's crimes. The police forensics team, clad in white suits and masks, entered the apartment. The pervasive stench of decay hit them immediately, a smell that had been a silent alarm bell for months. They began their meticulous work, cataloging a scene of utter depravity. In the bedroom, they found the 2 skulls Dahmer had mentioned, one bleached, and one still covered with a thin layer of skin. They were not hidden. They were displayed, like trophies. In the filing cabinet, a human heart, carefully preserved. In the freezer, wrapped in plastic bags, were heads and other body parts. The most disturbing discovery was the large blue drum in the corner of the living room. A drum Dahmer had once told neighbors contained his souvenirs. Inside, filled with a black, acidic sludge, were the remains of 3 of his victims. The acid had not fully dissolved the bodies, leaving a slurry of bone and flesh that was almost impossible to identify. It was a macabre science experiment, a final, horrifying attempt to erase his victims. But the horror was not just in the remains. It was in the details. The police found the Polaroids, a catalog of death taken by Dahmer himself. These photos, far from being just evidence, were a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer. They showed Dahmer's victims, both before and after their deaths, often posed in demeaning positions. The photos were not just memories. They were a collection of trophies, a way for Dahmer to relive his crimes and keep his victims forever. The media was in a frenzy. The news spread like wildfire, painting a picture of a quiet, unassuming man who had been hiding a house of horrors for years. The public was sickened, but also fascinated. They couldn't reconcile the image of the polite, bespectacled man on television with the gruesome details of the case. The press began to give him a nickname, the Milwaukee Monster, a name that perfectly captured the public's fear and disgust. The full truth had come out, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Every eye was on the man in the dark suit. The man who had become the face of pure evil, Jeffrey Dahmer, now an infamous figure, sat emotionless as the prosecution laid out a case so horrifying it was almost unbelievable. The jury heard testimony from the officers who had discovered the apartment, the medical examiner who had identified the remains, and a forensic pathologist who described the unspeakable injuries on the victims' bodies. The details were so graphic, so sickening, that many in the courtroom broke down in tears. Dahmer, however, remained a statue. He rarely showed emotion, only a quiet, almost bored expression. He was not a showman like Ted Bundy, nor was he a fanatical leader like Charles Manson. He was something colder, something more terrifyingly mundane. He was a monster who seemed to understand the clinical nature of his crimes and showed no remorse for them. The prosecutor, a seasoned veteran, pointed this out to the jury, arguing that Dahmer was a calculating killer who knew exactly what he was doing. But then, the defense took the floor. Their argument was simple and shocking. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a killer. He was insane. The defense called a series of psychiatrists and psychologists to the stand, men who had spent hours talking to Dahmer, trying to get inside his mind. They testified about his dark fantasies, his deep-seated feelings of loneliness, and his compulsion to turn people into objects. They argued that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia and cannibalism, a sickness of the mind that drove him to do things he had no control over. The defense was not arguing that he didn't commit the crimes. They were arguing that he was not in his right mind when he did. The courtroom was divided. Some saw it as a desperate attempt to avoid a life sentence, an insult to the victims and their families. Others saw it as a legitimate explanation for acts that seemed too monstrous to be human. As the arguments continued, the focus shifted from what Dahmer had done to why he had done it. Was he a cold-blooded killer? Or a man driven mad by a psychological disorder? The questions lingered in the air. A final, unsettling part of the story. The truth was out. But the deeper meaning, the nature of the fiend, was still a mystery. The courtroom, once a sterile stage for legal arguments, was transformed into a crucible of raw emotion. The families of the victims had waited for this day. For years, they had lived in a limbo of uncertainty, believing their loved ones had simply run away or fallen victim to the unforgiving streets. Now, they were faced with a truth more grotesque than any nightmare. As the families took the stand, the focus of the trial shifted from the twisted mind of the killer to the profound humanity of those he had taken. The mother of Errol Lindsay, Catherine, addressed Dahmer directly, her voice, shaking with a mixture of grief and rage, cut through the silence of the courtroom. She spoke of her son's smile, his dreams, and the empty space he had left behind. Her testimony wasn't about the facts of the case. It was about the crushing weight of loss. She looked at Dahmer, not with fear, but with a fierce, burning hatred. "I hope you burn in hell, you motherfucker," she screamed, her voice cracking. The room was a gasp, a collective release of the fury that had been building for months. Other families followed. The father of Stephen Hicks, Dahmer's first victim, spoke of the son he had lost and the 13 years of not knowing what happened. The mothers of Konarak Synthasamphone and Anthony Sears spoke of their boys, their beautiful boys, who had been discarded like trash. Their words were not just testimony, they were a public lament, a painful demand for justice and recognition. They stood on a stage of unimaginable horror, reclaiming the identities of their loved ones from the man who had tried to erase them. Dahmer sat across from them, a stone-faced ghost. He showed no reaction, no glimmer of remorse. His silence, his detachment, only deepened the family's pain and fueled their rage. They were fighting for the memory of their sons against a man who saw them as objects, as things to be used and discarded. The trial became a battle not just for a verdict, but for the very soul of the victims. And in that courtroom, surrounded by the echoes of their rage and tears, the families made sure that the world would never forget the men behind the headlines. The final arguments began, a dramatic showdown that would decide not just Dahmer's fate, but the legal definition of his sanity. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney E. Michael McCann, presented a chilling final picture. They argued that Dahmer's ability to plan his crimes, to lure victims, to cover his tracks, and to evade capture proved he was a rational, calculating killer. They pointed to the meticulous way he organized his trophies, the careful notes he kept, and his ability to lie to police officers. These were not the acts of a madman, they argued, but the actions of a cold-blooded monster. The prosecution's case was clear. Dahmer was guilty and sane. The defense, however, saw things differently. Led by attorney Gerald Boyle, they painted a portrait of a man driven by uncontrollable urges. They argued that Dahmer's grotesque obsessions, his desire to create a living zombie, to consume human flesh, and to preserve body parts were so far outside the realm of human behavior that they could only be the result of a severe mental illness. A sane person, they insisted, could not possibly commit such acts. They argued that a sane person could not believe they were making a friend out of a dismembered corpse. The defense was not seeking to exonerate him, but to have him committed to a mental institution rather than prison. The jury was faced with an impossible choice. Was it a man so evil he was beyond the law? Or a man so sick he was beyond all help? The media and the public were watching, divided on the issue. Was there a legal definition for a soul so broken? Was it possible to separate an act of pure evil from an illness of the mind? The verdict would not just decide the case, but would also become a national referendum on the nature of evil itself. After a short deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They had found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty. The final, horrifying chapter of the trial was about to be written. The silence in the courtroom was a tangible thing, a heavy weight that settled on every person present. The jury foreman read the verdict, guilty. Then, the sentence, 15 consecutive life terms in prison. A quiet cheer, a collective sigh of relief, rippled through the room. Justice, of a kind, had been served. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer was over, but its echo would linger for years. He was killed in prison in 1994, beaten to death by another inmate. His death, like his life, was a chillingly violent end to a man whose legacy was one of unspeakable horror. But the story didn't die with him. The Oxford Apartments, On s'est quiet, unassuming building, was torn down, replaced by a vacant lot that no one ever bought. The space remained empty for decades, a silent memorial to the lives lost there. The victims' families, shattered and forever changed, found no true closure. Their sons, brothers, and husbands were gone, and the public fascination with the monster who took them never faded. The city of Milwaukee, once a bustling, blue-collar town, was now forever linked to the name of a killer. In the end, the horror of Jeffrey Dahmer was not just about the body parts in the freezer or the skulls in the closet. It was about the system that failed to protect the vulnerable. It was about the ordinary-looking man who was able to deceive an entire community and the police force meant to protect it. It was about the thin, fragile line between normal and monstrous, and the terrible realization that a neighbor, a friend, or even a stranger on the street could be hiding a darkness beyond comprehension. The terror of Jeffrey Dahmer began with a simple invitation, an offer of a beer and a handshake. The scariest part of the story isn't what happened behind the locked door of apartment 213, but the simple, haunting fact that the man who opened it looked just like anyone else. The trial was over. The media circus had packed up and moved on. Jeffrey Dahmer, now inmate number 210,065, was serving his sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution. The families of the victims had received their verdict, but for many, there was no sense of peace, only a new kind of emptiness. The grief was a slow, consuming fire. The parents of the victims had to learn to live with a new, permanent truth. Their sons were not just gone. They had been subjected to unspeakable horrors. The details of the murders, once a secret held only by the killer, were now public knowledge, broadcast on television, and rehashed in newspapers. For the families, every news report, every documentary, every book was a painful reminder of what their loved ones had endured. The public fascination with Dahmer was a wound that refused to heal. People sent fan mail to a killer, morbidly curious about the man who had committed such acts. This morbid curiosity felt like a final act of disrespect, a twisting of the knife in an already shattered heart. The physical reminders of the case were erased. The Oxford Apartments. The building that had been a silent witness to a dozen murders was torn down in 1992. The lot where it once stood remained a desolate, empty space for decades. No one wanted to build there. It was a tangible mark of the city's collective trauma, a testament to a wound that was too deep to heal. For the city of Milwaukee, the name Dahmer would be forever etched into its identity, a ghost that haunted its history. But the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just a tale of a serial killer. It's a story about a society that failed to listen. It's about a system that ignored the cries of a concerned citizen. It's about the silent failures of law enforcement and a public that was too quick to judge and dismiss. It's about a man who was so adept at blending in, at being what people expected him to be, that he was able to hide his monstrous nature for years. In the end, the horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment was not just in what was found, but in the truth it revealed about us. It showed that evil can wear a polite smile, that a house of horrors can be hidden behind a locked door, and that the greatest monsters often live right next door, looking just like anyone else.